The mid-90s in Los Angeles was not the most harmonious time in the city's history, to say the least. It was a time of uncontrolled gang violence and racial strife, exacerbated by the Rodney King and O.J. Simpson affairs. It's fair to say there was a lot of anger about, but into this mix came some out-of-the-box thinkers who had an idea how to calm those destructive passions. And that idea was cricket. Yeah, cricket. That baffling and slightly poncy English game, played by supposedly slightly poncy white Englishmen in white flannel on village greens in white English villages, with white spectators and white wives making tea and sandwich triangles in white bread. So how was cricket going to help? Well, the first cricket team, the Los Angeles Crickets, with a K, was formed by a movie producer, Katie Haber, and a homeless activist, Ted Hayes, who said, "The aim of playing cricket is to teach people how to respect themselves and respect authority so they stop killing each other." Now that's quite obviously quite a laudable aim, but how would that work in the hyper-masculine world of the mean streets of Compton, which must be the hardest and by extension perhaps the coolest neighbourhood in North America? Well, the thing about cricket is that it is all about the ethics of the game. It's competitive, to be sure, but the ideal of sportsmanship is paramount. It's not all about winning. It's really not. It's about player conduct more than anything, at least in England. In Australia, in India, in Pakistan and in the West Indies, it is much more about winning. In fact, in Australia, what is paramount is winning, particularly, especially and specifically when playing against England. And boy, do they win often. But in England, it is all about how you conduct yourself when playing the game. You applaud, for instance, when the other side plays well. So this guy, Ted Hayes, realised this and thought that he could make a difference to some of those young men that were heading for jail, or worse. And he did. I don't know how many he helped, since I don't know much detail. But the renamed Compton Cricket Club still exists, I believe, and has toured England and Australia, and a match was planned against the newest national team of Afghanistan, of all places. So I suppose he recognised that in a place like South Central Los Angeles, in order to survive, machismo is everything. Toughness is revered, weakness derided and probably punished. In a super macho world, nobody wants to back down. To do so is to acknowledge weakness, or at least the appearance of it, which in effect is just as bad. But of course, it being America, it is quite literally an arms race of machismo, and all too often the conclusion is as ugly as it gets. But playing cricket is an antidote to this, by playing it well, and by that I mean by playing it with sportsmanship as the highest ideal. It is a way of experiencing a kinder, gentler, and yes, a more polite society. I'm just guessing here, since although I have for years planned a cross-country trip that would end at the Queen Mary in Long Beach, I've never been to the City of Angels. That's a Spitfire going over. But I would imagine that to many young men in that neighbourhood, a polite society might well have been something they had never experienced. I also imagine, I'm still guessing here remember, that being in an environment like that might have been a bit of a release from the harsh streets of every day. I imagine it might be a place where you could relax, rather than worrying about whether that guy might pull a gun on you, just for looking at him funny. Like I say, I don't know, and I wouldn't presume to know, but the very existence of such a club, at such a time, in such a place, suggests there are other ways of being, different from how they usually are. So how does this relate to anything? Well, if we come back to the cultural battle of ideas currently raging primarily online, then there are parallels. I never go on Facebook or Twitter and wouldn't know how to Insta-chat. But YouTube is a gangster's paradise, and the weapons are words. But there are those who wish that words shouldn't be used as weapons, but what they really mean is that the words they don't like shouldn't be used. Because words are weapons sometimes. Most of the time they're tools, but sometimes they are, by necessity, weapons. But they're great weapons. They're great because, used well, they prevent us from having to use real weapons. Weapons that damage skin and bone and muscle and nerve endings and vital internal organs, rather than just feelings. So to those who protested against free speech at the Day for Freedom, because their feelings were hurt, I ask, would you prefer the alternative? Because the alternative is where more than feelings are hurt. Now, I'm a free speech absolutist, in that I believe that there should be no limit whatsoever to speech. I even believe, to quote the standard qualification promoted by those who wish to limit speech, and thereby break the principle, that people shouldn't be allowed to shout fire in a crowded theatre. I wouldn't, and almost certainly shouldn't, but that doesn't mean that it should be illegal, since by making it so, it establishes the principle that I am responsible for others' actions. And once that principle is breached, how many other things that others do will I be responsible for? But even though I am a free speech absolutist and believe that all speech, no matter how hurtful or offensive or stupid or cruel or nasty or ill-informed, is valid, there is still a responsibility in using it. As I say, it is a weapon after all. And some of us who profess a belief in freedom of speech are not being responsible. I've mentioned before that I was disappointed that Ali Darwar was prevented from speaking, or not allowed, or was not invited at the Day for Freedom. Not that I thought he would even have had anything valuable to say, but in keeping with my aforementioned principle, even his nutty opinions had a validity. Tobin Robinson has given an explanation as to the reasons, and you can take from them what you will, but as I understand it, it revolved around one of his staff, a young woman called Lucy, who mistakenly, or deliberately, depending on your point of view, printed an itinerary with him scheduled to speak. I don't know what's true. Some say it was a mix-up. Others, however, seem to believe that this Lucy was some sort of fifth columnist within Tommy's staff. And the amount of vitriol levelled at her really has been beyond the pale. In a picture of her and Ali Darwar, who she seemed to have met in the street, it says, "Little bitch with her new pimp." Other comments included, "A dirty no-good cunt," "grassing slag," "a Judas bitch," "lefty whorebag," "turncoat and grass," "two-faced cunt," "snide Antifa cunt," "two-faced grass cunt," "dirty Muslim-loving bitch," and my favourite, "a no-good, grassing, Muslim-loving, dirty fucking scum cunt," which has kind of got it all in one pithy phrase. Geez, I think I've used up my allocation of the C word for the rest of the year with that lot. But you know, I know you're angry. I'm angry. But it's one thing to think it, and another to say it in the heat of the moment. But to actually take the trouble to log in to Twitter, where I think all those came from, and to type it in for all the world to see, and in perpetuity, I might add, just makes you look like the angry, stupid morons they all say we are. When you say things like that, all that is remembered is the response. The provocation is forgotten. Now, I speak as someone who has, in the past, had a problem with my temper. And at the time, when I'm having my paddy, when I'm spitting my dummy out, I feel justified. I really do. But when I'm effing and blinding and throwing things around and basically behaving like a petulant toddler, all that is remembered is the tantrum. The reason for the show of temper is lost. Completely. For a funny illustration of this, have a look at Bill Burr's 12 Reasons to Hit a Woman. All of these examples are instances where people are not being responsible with the weapon of language, and it needs reining in because it's damaging the cause. How can we argue for the freedom to speak our minds and what's genuinely in our hearts when some of us utter the most hate-filled bile the instant it pops into our heads? We need to control ourselves and be the best we can be. We need to be better than them. And we need to be better than the moron at the latest protest who kept giving Nazi salutes. That kind of shit really only helps them. Now, a lot of the energy of the protests has come from the football crowd. And Tommy Robinson, I believe, was once a part of that. Now, I'm not a football fan, but I do take the point made in the past by Tommy himself that it was never going to be the well-spoken, respectable and polite middle class that was ever going to be prepared to be rude by complaining about Muslim paedophile rape squads. It was people like him that were going to have to do it. And he did, and was predictably hated by that same well-spoken, respectable and polite middle class for his trouble. After all, it wasn't their teenage daughters that were getting gang raped. So this movement has a lot to thank the FLA and the DFLA and the rest of the football crowd to be thankful for. Even if this goes no further, and Britain does completely sink into the Orwellian nightmare that those in power desire, I'll always remember it was a football crowd that brought about the delicious sight of London's fascist paramilitary riot police literally running scared from the protesters. So we need the football fans. We need their stridency, we need their tribalism, we need their "we're not going to take it anymore, fuck you" attitude, and we need their numbers. But, and it is a big but, we also need to know when to fight and when to just resist. The fact that the riot police were chased away tells us something. It tells us they were surprised by the strength of feeling. They were surprised by the numbers. They weren't prepared. If they were, there would have been 5 times as many police there. So now, having demonstrated the depth of our rage, it is now to use our strength, our numbers, in resistance. For resistance can be just as effective, and it is less likely to provoke a backlash by the authorities. And this is a real and present danger. It may even be the authorities' long game. This may have been their plan all along. Arrest a known but controversial dissident like Tommy Robinson on a trumped up but technically justifiable charge to enrage his supporters and provoke them into doing something that enables the government to justify ever more draconian measures. The government has, up until now, been engaging in what David Icke calls the totalitarian tiptoe: blanket surveillance, hate speech laws, covert and seemingly innocuous slicing off of small pieces of our liberties. But now might be the time that the liberal democratic mask slips, revealing the vicious totalitarian behind it. That time may, just may, be upon us. So we need to remain firm and resolute in our protests, but at the same time we need to be very, very careful not to give them an excuse to clamp down. I said in a previous video that I thought it was possible that we could win this war, and I still believe we could, but we are at a point where it could go either way. We have increasing numbers on our side. What's the consensus of the numbers at the last demo? 10,000? 20? More perhaps? And I'll bet they weren't all there just for Tommy, just as all those who turned up at the Day for Freedom weren't. Tommy's a totem. He happens to be the man of the moment who people have rallied round. But it's really not about him. And now many, many people are still far from comfortable in showing support for Tommy, but went on the demo anyway. Because free speech, and by extension, a free country, is bigger than all of us. But we are at the moment, or at least very close to it, when we might conceivably begin to turn the tide against the fascistic impulses of our government, or we will instead fall beneath their jackboots. So I would humbly suggest that now that our anger has been suitably demonstrated, and I think it has, now is the time for a more measured approach. More marches, of course, in order to keep up the pressure, and in more places, and not just the big cities. But perhaps for a while, a bit more resistance and a bit less fight. A bit more cricket, if you will, and a bit less football. Now is the moment when how we play the game is as important as whether we win or lose, because in a stand-up fight with the government, we will lose. Gandhi and Martin Luther King changed the world with non-violent resistance, and they are almost universally revered for their restraint. The time is not yet upon us for Churchill's violent resistance, although that may still be in our future. I sincerely believe that our government's intention is to manoeuvre us into a position in which we can be isolated from the rest of the population, most of whom agree with us, by the way, even if they are repelled by the figure of Tommy Robinson. One of the most common opinions in the modern world is the defeatist idea that we, as citizens, have no power. Of course, it can often seem like that, when most of us only interact with the democratic process by putting a cross on a ballot paper once every 5 years, and it never seems to make that much of a difference. But that is propaganda put about by those who want us to disengage completely from the political process. If they say you have no power, then you won't bother voting. And so, guess what? They're right. A cynical population is the kind of population they want. A population that believes that there's no point in voting won't vote, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. See, I told you had no power. But there is a great, big, heavy, greasy spanner in the works of that position. Brexit. For once, we were asked, and against all conventional wisdom, against all the predictions, we told them. They won't be making that mistake again. And it has been delicious watching them duck and weave and squirm and backslide in their efforts to undermine our decision, but at the same time to not look as if they are. Sometimes, just sometimes, democracy does work. Some of you will remember the petrol protest in the year 2000, I think it was. That was a very British protest. Very cricket. I can't remember exactly what the issue was, but I believe it revolved around the amount of tax that was being levied on fuel. As I remember it, it was led by very hard-pressed self-employed lorry drivers who were being squeezed out of business by the hefty taxes, and they decided to take a stand. In a loosely coordinated effort, they blocked the entrance of tens of thousands of petrol stations around the country and waited for the government response. Like most modern just-in-time economies, the UK only had about a 3-day supply of most materials, but was even more reliant on road haulage than many others, and the protest began to bite immediately. The Prime Minister of the time, the slimy Tony Blair, immediately tried to demonise the protesters by whining that babies were dying in incubators, which they absolutely were not. The protest, despite the inconveniences, had widespread public support, and the drivers were very aware of their conduct. Ambulances were let through to fill up, as were doctors, any doctors, nurses, medical and care staff, and anyone who could demonstrate to any reasonable degree that they were delivering to hospitals or any medical establishments. Nobody died, certainly not any babies. Nobody was beaten up, and the drivers held their positions and bided their time. They waited until they'd secured most of what they wanted from the government. They made their point, and then the protest evaporated like the spring snows. Change is possible, and what's more, it's achievable without civil war. We are powerful. We the people, to use an unnecessarily American phrase, do have the power to change things. This country belongs to us, not them. of all this talk of whether or not Parliament or the government of the day is sovereign in deciding what happens regarding leaving the EU is nonsense. Of course, the government of the day is not sovereign, but then neither is Parliament, despite what the statute books may say. And even then, technically, Parliament is less sovereign than the actual sovereign, so long as the Queen does what she is told. But the government is not sovereign, and neither is Parliament, and nor is the monarch. We, the citizens of the United Kingdom, are really sovereign. The referendum proves it, and don't let anyone, anywhere, tell you any different. We're in charge, but they will do everything in their power to stop you from believing that very simple fact. I'll see you on the streets.